especially to those of you brand new to this class. We've been going through the book of Job, looking at science in the book of Job, and looking not so much at the story in Job and the moral lessons in Job, but looking at the language in Job and pulling out science. That the book of Job supports a lot of science. We've looked at climatology, we've looked at geology, we've looked at a whole bunch of different things. And we're getting really close to the topic that originally captured my attention on all the science in Job, which is ice age indicators in the book of Job. That's in 2 weeks. But before we talk about the ice age, it's important to talk about what caused the ice age. It's the flood. Oh, I forgot to. We're doing videos for, we're good? Okay. I forgot to make sure we were good. Before we look at the ice age, I want to look at the language in the book of Job and the indicators of the recent flood. When you look at the timelines in biblical history, it's easy to see where all the patriarchs are. But Job doesn't tell you exactly when he was alive. It's just a happening. But there are clues, and we're going to look at some of those today, about when he was alive and see the flood through the lens of Job. It's our belief that Job was one of the first books written. The book of Job actually predates the writing of Genesis. Not all the events of Genesis, but the writing of Genesis. One of the interesting things I've discovered while researching for today is that a lot of secular archaeologists will say, well, the Genesis flood is actually taken from earlier records because there are earlier written stories. But what they don't take into account is that while Moses wrote Genesis way later, Job was written about the same time as Abraham was alive. So this is hundreds of years before Moses was even born. And so I think it's very important to see what this first book written from the Bible says about the flood. This is the second major event that shaped the destiny of all mankind. The first one, of course, being Adam and Eve's choice to sin. But the second one was the flood. It changed the planet. And if it changed the planet, and we believe it did, and we believe what God's word says, then people who lived shortly afterwards would say something about it, right? So let's look at this in the book of Job. First of all, there are initial indications of the flood. This picture is by John Taylor, and I had to say his work is displayed at the Ark Encounter, which I'm hoping to see in April. But he paints a lot of biblical stories and wanted to point that out. In Job 22, 15 through 16, and if you have your Bibles, you can open the book of Job. We're going to flip through a lot. You don't have to turn to every reference. But Job 22, 15 through 16 says, "Will you keep to the old way, which wicked men have trod, who were cut down before their time, whose foundations were swept away by a flood?" This references an older catastrophe in which the foundations were swept away by a flood. Although it does not provide the full story of the flood, as found in Genesis 6 through 9, it corroborates the idea of a cataclysmic deluge that drastically altered life on earth. The ancient patriarch Job is generally considered to be set in a time frame either comparable to or preceding the patriarchal period of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, thus placing him relatively close to the time of the flood narrative, which was preserved and retold among early civilizations. What major event happened shortly after the flood? Babel. The Tower of Babel and the dispersion and all these new languages. Secular historians who look at all the mythologies around the world go, this is really weird that all these civilizations have flood stories. But there must have been lots of little floods all over the planet so that all these cultures have this memory of it. But that's not what we believe. I'm going to do a quick scan through of some of the possible references in Job to flood and flood clues. Job 9, 5 through 8, and 12, 14 through 15 mentions God shaking the earth, moving mountains, and restraining the seas. Job 14, 11 through 12 describes seas drying up and rivers vanishing, implying massive water displacement. Job 22, 15 through 17, which we just read, compares the wicked's fate to those who are swept away by a flood, and this seems to be a reference to Noah's judgment. Job 26, 10 through 14 speaks of God setting boundaries for the sea and stirring up the waters, possibly reflecting flood conditions. Job 38, 8 through 11, God describes setting limits for the sea, asking Job if he was there when the waters were confined. We will come back to these references later, but for now, I want you to see that there's at least some understanding in the book of Job of what a flood is, what it does, and how big it might have been. Any good researcher will provide the counterpoint. So I want to give you the counterpoint today. The archaeological and scientific perspectives or explanations, there's an flood and a Black Sea flood that I've read a whole bunch of articles where they're like, we think this was it, but it couldn't have been it, which is very weird because at the beginning of the article, these secular scientists are like, this must have been it. And then they go, but it was much smaller than what anybody would have said. The flood, archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley discovered a thick clay layer at in Iraq, with pottery potentially representing a localized flood, though its scales debated. Sir Leonard Woolley excavated in southern Iraq between 1922 and 1934. Well, of course it's the flood, Lady Woolley casually remarked when her husband's excavation team uncovered a 8-foot thick layer of soil that contained no evidence of human activity, sandwiched between two layers of pottery. They were doing this dig. He actually dug a shaft straight down to see, okay, what am I looking at here? And when he got to a certain level, all the pottery disappeared. And then 8 feet further down through this thick layer of mud, there was more pottery. And when he told his wife, she was like, oh yeah, of course that's the flood. But it was only 8 feet of mud. And there's pottery on top and on the bottom. Woolley later retracted his identification of the flood stratum, arguing that the deposit was too old to have resulted from the biblical deluge, which I think is interesting. I would have said it would have been too young, but that's my perspective. Nevertheless, it offers strong evidence of flooding during the regional wet period that may have inspired the flood story. This is from an evolutionary scientific journal. Oh, this little layer of mud, it might be a memory that somebody said, oh, let's take this flood, this little thing that we experienced, and make it universal. Because we know that ancient civilizations exaggerated about a lot of things, right? We don't actually know that. But scientists seem to assume that. From the Creation Evolution Journal, Volume 8, Number 2, in spring of 1988, the flood levels at and Kish were identical and provided marvelous evidence for a historical kernel of the Genesis flood story. Similarities between the account of Noah's flood in the Hebrew scriptures and the Mesopotamian flood tales are great and obvious. Despite some lesser differences, there is no reasoned body of opinion that claims they are unrelated. The accepted view is that the archetypal account originated in Mesopotamia. The earliest extant Mesopotamian version is far older than the biblical account, and the flood story bears specifically Mesopotamian details that cannot reasonably be supposed to derive from a Hebrew original. I thought that interesting from a Creation Evolution Journal. Of course, I looked into what is the Creation Evolution Journal. It's a journal of scientists that go back and forth over creation and evolution. So some of them are creationists, some of them are evolutionists. And I think that this article particularly was from an evolutionary point of view. And they say that because they found cuneiform tablets that describe a flood. Obviously, clay tablets came before the King James Bible or any paper version of the Bible. So these are older, thus that was the original. And again, I point out that Job is an older book than people realize.
Even so, they're supposed to be describing the one real flood that
What?
God shows us in creation.
Imagine the logic required to say they could be describing the same. Yeah. This is a picture of the Black Sea, which I found intriguing because there's this theory of the Black Sea flood. Dr. Robert Ballard found evidence of sudden catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea around 5000 BC, theorized to have inspired the flood myth in ancient cultures. This was an ABC News article headline. I was like, so I read the article and it was all speculation and theory, but then I found what it was linked to. Noah's not so big flood. New evidence rebuts controversial theory of Black Sea deluge by Lonnie Lipskett in August 2009. A long time ago, that's a great way to start a scientific journal. Whether your time frame is biblical or geological, the Black Sea was a large freshwater black lake. It was cut off from the Mediterranean Sea by a high piece of land that dammed the entry of salt water through the narrow connecting Bosphorus Valley. And if you look here, the Bosphorus Valley is where all that white is just up there. There's a very narrow valley there. When Earth's last ice age waned, water frozen into vast ice sheets melted and returned to the ocean, elevating sea levels. About 9,400 years ago, the Mediterranean waters rose above the dam, reconnecting the two seas. They surged over the now submerged Bosphorus sill with the force of 200 Niagara Falls, according to a controversial theory proposed in 1997 by Columbia University marine geologists Bill Ryan and Walter Pittman. The resulting deluge, they speculated, could have wiped out early human settlements around the lake's perimeter and inspired the Noah's Ark story in the Bible, the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, and catastrophic flood myths, among other peoples. So this journal is saying this huge wall of water came over this one spot in the Black Sea, and because civilization had grown up around the Black Sea, which we know from archaeology, this sudden surge in the Black Sea's water levels wiped out the civilizations around the border. The survivors fled, and they went to all the different countries with this flood story. But as I continued reading the article, a new study in 2009 suggests that if the flood occurred at all, it was much smaller, hardly of biblical proportions. Liviu Giosin of Woods Hole Oceanography Institution and Florin Philip and Stefan Constantinescu of the University of Bucharest found evidence the Black Sea lake water levels rose only 5 to 10 meters, not 50 to 60 meters, as Ryan and his colleagues proposed. The flood would have only drowned about 2,000 square kilometers of land, about half of Rhode Island, rather than 70,000 acres or kilometers, more than the entire state of West Virginia. So both of these floods, the scientific community originally goes, hey, this could be the original, and then they go, but it was much smaller. So imagine that one day you're sitting in your house and the creek rises and the water comes into your house and you get mud in your house. And then you tell the neighborhood that your city washed away in mud. And every civilization after that remembers that the entire city got washed away by mud because your house got wet. That's kind of the same level of exaggeration. These scientists are accusing all the ancient cultures of having this worldwide flood that's in all these different cultures based on one lake overflowing or a river overflowing. So let's look at the evidence in favor of Noah's flood.
Of course, what you just said too is ignoring all the evidence we can see around the world, whole world. I know it.
Yes.
Now,
Jeremy Myers, in an article online at redeeminggod.com, says, Evidence for an early date of the evidence of Job is seen in several ways. First, Job raised 2 complete families of 10 kids each, died 140 years after his testing. The Septuagint says he died at the age of 248. This puts him in the age range of Peleg from Genesis 10:25, who some think might have been Job's uncle, which when I was reading that genealogy just recently, in Genesis 10:29, there's a name Jobab, and some people think those two might be actually the same person. We don't know, because we don't get the genealogy of Job. We do get the genealogy of Jobab, but the ages are similar. Second, Job's wealth is listed as measured in livestock and possessions, not money, which is further evidence for an extremely early date of the events in Job. Finally, the events recorded in Job were probably events he was familiar with. This includes the post-flood ice age, Job 38:29 through 30, cavemen, or men dwelling in caves, 24:4 through 10, and 31 through 8, and the violent aftermath of the flood, which includes earthquakes, volcanoes, windstorms, and the raiding parties which decimated his first family. Okay, so let's look at the facts from the book of Job. First, we see water drying up. Job 14:11 through 12 says, as water disappears from the sea, and a river becomes parched and dries up, so a man lies down and does not rise. Till the heavens are no more, they will not awake, nor be roused from their sleep. And Job 12:15 says, if he withholds the waters, they dry up. If he sends them out, they overwhelm the earth. Now, let's ask the right question. What's the water drying up from? Matthew Henry, which of all my favorite commentators is the only one who consistently sees Noah's flood happening in Job, said, great wet is sometimes a great judgment. He raises the waters and overturns the earth, the productions of it, the buildings upon it. A sweeping rain is said to leave no food, Proverbs 28:3. See how many ways God has of contending with a sinful people and taking from them abused, forfeited mercies, and how utterly unable we are to contend with him. If we might invert the order, this verse would fitly refer to Noah's flood, that ever memorable instance of the divine power. God then, in wrath, sent the waters out, and they overturned the earth. But in mercy he withheld them, shut the windows of heaven and the fountains of the deep, and then in a little time they dried up. So we see waters drying up. This is actually a picture of the Fertile Crescent. And a lot of people are confused because when you look at the Fertile Crescent today, aside from right on the riverbanks, it's desert. Yet all the great civilizations of ancient Earth rose in this area because there was a lot more fresh water and a lot more green earth that could support crops, culture, landscape. Where was the water going? Well, the water's going away. The water was being pulled out. Well, what was the water from? Why was there so much water? Well, the Great Flood covered everything in water. I don't know how long it took for the entire earth to dry out. Remember, it was 2 weeks Noah was in the ark after it landed on the top of the mountain before it was dry enough for him to get off the ark. So I imagine it took a while, and depending on the types of soil, different continents held the water better than other continents. But we see this water disappearing. If the water's disappearing, there's not a constant refreshing. It must have been something big to charge up that water that hasn't happened again. Next up, the dead in the water. What event? This is a picture, a painting of the flood of Noah and companions. And I muted that because it's a bunch of Renaissance type pictures because, you know, in the Renaissance, they figured nobody in the Bible knew what clothes were. So all these dying people, dying bodies, the waters are coming up and there's actually lions and bears and dogs and anything that could scrabble up to the highest point, trying to hang on as the floodwaters rise. Job 26:5 says, "The dead tremble, those under the waters and those inhabiting them." David Guzik said, "Many suggestions have been offered for the identity of these watery dead. Some think that Job believed Sheol was a watery abyss, connected it with an idea suggested by 2 Samuel 22:5. Others think it is just a poetical way of describing those who are buried in the lowest pit, in the depths, Psalm 88:6. Some even believe those inhabiting the waters are actually fish and sea creatures. According to David Guzik, it seems best to regard it as poetic and non-technical description of the uncertainty, darkness, and gloom of the world beyond." Even Matthew Henry leaned in that direction. He said, "He forms dead things under the waters." And that's a different translation of the same words. Rephaim, giants, are formed under the waters. That is, vast creatures of prodigious bulk, as whales, giant-like creatures among the innumerable inhabitants of the water. But I decided, let's see what the Hebrew words are. The word for the dead is rapha. It properly is dead. Figuratively, it's a ghost. These are the dead in plural only. This is not a dead person. This is many dead. Dead, deceased. These are not living creatures. These are dead things. And they're in the waters, under the waters. And the word tremble was an interesting one because I was like, well, if they're dead, are they really trembling? This properly means to twist or whirl, to dance. Imagine for a moment, after the flood, the waters are receding, and what happened to all the bodies? Well, that's something that we ask a lot. How come we do not find a large deposit of human remains with all the dinosaur and other animal fossils? There's a very good reason for that. Human beings are more intelligent than most animals. They would have grabbed onto anything they could to try and survive the flood. They would have been in the water more. How long could they swim? I don't think they could swim very long. But as they died, their bodies would not have fallen to the ocean floor. They would have been stirred up. They would have been bashed about. And there's a term that I did not write down because it was interesting, but it was referring to what the human body does, how it decomposes in water. We turn into particulates. We dissipate mostly. But when I see this, the dead, picture a body of water, and I did not put any of these pictures up here because the pictures I found were like more gruesome than I wanted to show. But picture a ton of dead bodies, human and animal bodies in water that is moving. Any of you see Lord of the Rings? There was a dead marshes and there's these bodies under the water. A little creepy. In the time of just after the flood, where the waters weren't frozen, there's all these bodies of the people who had survived the flood. I mean, they were intact, but they weren't alive. They're dead, and they're in the water, and the water's moving. And you look in the water, and what do you see? Whole bunch of dead bodies moving around, just kind of swirling. Like at the end of the bathtub, as all the dirt is swirling around in the drain, these bodies are swirling in the water. That's what Job is seeing. Now, am I going to stake it theologically 100% that's what's happening? No, but when I look at the words and look at the timing, that's what I'm envisioning. Job is literally talking about bodies of water, bodies in the bodies of water. The dead are still decomposing and being eaten by scavengers, but they're still bodies.
So is it that soon that he's actually still seeing them, or is he imagining?
Don't know.
Okay.
It's a great question that I was not able to I can't pin down when Job was alive. And was this something Job saw, or was this something that Shem saw? In fact, that brings us to the next fact from Job: extreme old age. What's the time frame? Job 15:10 says, both the gray-haired and the aged are among us, much older than your father. The gray-haired is seb. It's a primitive root. It means to become aged, by implication, to grow gray. Those of us who have gray in our hair, but it isn't all the way gray yet, that's where we are. We're getting older. But that's not a bad thing. It just means we're no longer the youth. There's another word, which is yashesh, which is from an unused root meaning to blanch. That means gray-haired. That means you've arrived at old age. But then there's a word that is only used in the book of Job, nowhere else in the Bible, and it's used 4 times. It means a very aged man, or ancient. That's the word for very old. And it's from the same as yashesh, it's yashish. Very old. Ancient. Decrepit. This is like way past old. And when I was looking for pictures of old people, 100, 110, 112, Job was 140 years older when he died than when he went through this persecution, this trial by God. He was probably 100 years old when that started. He died at the age of 250, and yet much older than your father. Ancient people like Shem were still living during Job's lifetime. Imagine knowing Shem was born before the flood. He's still alive a couple hundred years later, yet your great-grandparents died after only having lived about 300 years. I mean, I can't imagine having great-grandparents who lived 300 years. And Shem is going to outlive them. In fact, Shem probably outlived Job by almost 400 years, with a total lifespan of 600 compared to Job's about 250. And just to remind you, Shem outlived Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Shem, Ham, and Japheth were the only, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth outlived the flood. Noah was alive for 390 years after the flood, but Shem was alive much longer than that. Though the generation after the flood had much shorter lifetimes, they were around 400 years. And by the time of Abraham, 200 years old was significant. Job is in between with an estimated lifetime around 250. And yet they're not talking about Job as the old guy in the room. They say both the gray-haired and the aged are among us, much older than your father. Not much older than you, much older than your father. Who are these really old people? The fact that there are likely many multi-centurions around them who had been alive just after the flood, watched Babel get built and probably helped, and the peoples afterwards disperse, makes it very likely that the reason for this special word for very old in the book of Job is because Job is in that time frame where these 500-600-year-old men are still walking around, still talking about the experiences they went through. And let's look at the next one. Living witnesses. We hear a lot from Job's friends and from Job about things that sound like the flood. Who could have told them? And this chart pixelated a little bit, but you can see Shem here. This is Noah's timeline. So that blue line is the flood, and this is 350 years after the flood that Noah lived. And this is Shem, and Arphaxad, and Selah, and Eber, and then Peleg, and Ru, Sereg, Nahor, Terah, Abraham. So this dotted line is Abraham's death. And you can see that there's a bunch of people who lived during the flood and just after the flood who are still alive during the time frame of Job. If we imagine Job, I'm going to walk over here. If we imagine Job lived somewhere in this time frame where we see the 230, these 230-year-olds were about the same age of longevity as Job. So somewhere in there, all these generations were still alive. I mean, did people die? Yeah, people died. But imagine the shock of Shem and Ham and Japheth as they watched the younger generations dying off earlier and earlier and earlier. And Shem is still alive, still talking to people, still telling people, hey, this is why the world got judged. This is how the world got judged. I helped build the ark. I was on the ark for a year. I saw what was left of the world when we got off. I was there. Job's friends and Job's friends' families probably knew at least one or two people who lived just after the flood, and it's not unlikely that the family of the Shemites or Semites talked to their ancestor from time to time and knew who he was. Maybe got an audience with him every year. Hey, great grandpa, can you tell me that story again? He was there. He was around. The references in the book of Job to the flood are couched in the language of those who had personal knowledge of the event. Modern creationists and flood geologists can only surmise what may have happened during the year of the flood, but Job and his friends were living during the lifetime of Noah and his sons and had probably heard the account of the flood. The families of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar had spoken to the original occupants of the ark, and they knew. This is Dr. Henry Morris. This is not me saying they did. This is Dr. Morris saying they most likely did. If these men had not heard directly from the mouths of Noah or one of his sons, then they had heard from their fathers or their fathers' fathers who had heard directly. Noah lived 350 years after the flood. Shem lived 502 years beyond the day they disembarked from the ark. And Shem outlived Abraham. There were living witnesses to the flood while Job was alive. Why wouldn't these terms be so carefully designed? Why wouldn't we expect to hear firsthand accounts of what happened during the flood? All right, more facts from Job. Mountains eroding. When would people have observed this? And this is a permafrost melt causing a landslide. So this was frozen water inside dirt that was all mixed together during the flood that had frozen during the ice age, and this melted in 2020. So this is a recent melt event. But Job, who was living at the end of the ice age, the big ice age, where everything was frozen and still thawing out, probably saw stuff like this happen more frequently. He may have been around when he saw the whatever happened to the Black Sea happen. But he's looking at the mountains eroding. Job 14, 18 through 19 says, but as a mountain falls away and crumbles, and as a rock is moved from its place, as water wears away stones, and as torrents wash away the soil of the earth, so you destroy the hope of man. Job 9, 4 through 8 says, God is wise in heart and mighty in strength. Who has hardened himself against him and prospered? He removes the mountains, and they do not know. When he overturns them in his anger, he shakes the earth out of his place, and its pillars tremble. He commands the sun, and it does not rise. He seals off the stars. He alone spreads the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. Okay. Secular scientists. I've read too many articles to cite any one, but most of them say there's no possible way that Job could have known the water erodes stone, because erosion is the slow process. It's extremely slow process. Like, dude, we know about erosion. How could Job not know about erosion? Of course, if you discount the flood evidence and you discount any truth of what the Bible says, and then you make up this made-up story about how long age of the earth is, and then try and figure out how long it would take for a tiny stream to cut the Grand Canyon, of course you're going to go, there's no way Job could have observed erosion. I read so many articles that said, it sounds like erosion, but it really isn't. And I'm like, what else is it? You're deluding yourself. Job saw erosion happening on massive levels. We talk about the geology of North America and how glaciers cut through mountains. And we look at the Grand Canyon, and Answers in Genesis and ICR both have great articles about this. The ice sheet actually made it down through Colorado. And as the Ice Age was ending, there was an ice dam that blocked the Colorado River and turned it into this massive lake upstream of the Grand Canyon. And when that ice dam melted or broke, we don't know which it was, it washed through the Grand Canyon, which wasn't so grand before this. This was a massive, rapid erosion event. And the archaeologists and geologists who study the Grand Canyon, who are honest with themselves, say there's no way this could have happened slowly. Look at how wide it is on top. It's almost straight down for a large portion of it, and then it curves down at the bottom. That has to happen rapidly. It can't happen slowly. If it happened over even 100 years, you'd see more bowline lakes, oxbow lakes, where the water changes direction because it's cut through this rock and then it meets another rock which is softer and it goes a different direction. The Grand Canyon is surprisingly one line. It all happened at once in a great burst of energy. Job was living at the end of the Ice Age. He was watching this happen as ice breaks off of these ice sheets. And he talks about, next time I'll talk about Ice Age stuff. But ice being given birth. It's calving off of these glaciers. And these glaciers would break off icebergs. What happens to an iceberg in the ocean? It splashes, goes off to sea and melts. What happens to an iceberg in the mountains? It runs downhill. And it tumbles and carves out dirt and rock. Job could have seen this happening. Matthew Henry says, "Thus great is God's power, and how great then is his goodness, which causes his sun to shine even upon the evil and unthankful, though he could withhold it. That he made the stars also can, if he pleases, seal them up and hide them from our eyes. By earthquakes and subterraneous fires, mountains have sometimes been removed and the earth shaken. In very dark and cloudy days and nights, it seems to us as if the sun were forbidden to rise and the stars were sealed up." It is sufficient to say that Job here speaks of what God can do. But if we must understand of it what he has done in fact, all these verses may be applied to Noah's flood. When the mountains of the earth were shaken, the sun and the stars were darkened, and the world that now is, we believe to be reserved for that fire which will consume the mountains, melt the earth with its fervent heat, and which will turn the sun into darkness. All the stuff that happened here that Job is describing happened during the flood. Job may not have seen that happening, but he did get to see erosion that was happening after the flood. You had a question or comment? It's a combination. There's lots of vegetation, some of it taller, some of it smaller. There's a chunk right here that's still intact because of the root systems of the vegetation that kind of floated down as an island intact. but that's all dirt that's washed out because it used to have lots of water in it that was put in there during the flood and got frozen and stayed in place for so long, and now it's melting and it kind of turned to mush.
I like what you said that, Jose. It makes it look a lot bigger. Picture those little things as trees.
Holly?
I was just thinking, I mean, I don't know why they wouldn't think that erosion was possible, because we all know that water's very heavy, and when it's frozen, it has the ability to melt within a fairly easily amount of time. And so we can see that, like if it was a rock, it wouldn't necessarily move, but water changes as it melts. And so of course it's going to cause different elements to move and things like that. I mean, I don't see why they would say that you couldn't see that, because we can even see that in real time.
But how many of us have actually watched an avalanche? Like you were there for an avalanche?
Just on YouTube.
Okay, so we got two who've seen an avalanche. How many of you actually seen water wipe away you see a mudslide or something similar to that?
On YouTube.
No, in person.
The beach was.
Okay. You've seen cliffs break down at the beach. You've seen rocks. How many of you seen a tree split a rock? Yeah. A lot of things take time, and we know about it because we have really good methods of recording and communicating. So we know about all these things. We were taught as kids about erosion. Job wasn't taught as a kid about erosion. He saw it happening firsthand. And that's the big difference. We don't see the large timescale events most of the time. I was not alive for Mount St. Helens, but I feel like I was because I was born just afterwards, and I saw so many documentaries. It was one of the first large-scale cataclysmic events that was actually recorded with videotape and cameras. We could see before and after. Spirit Lake, we saw petrified logs, all the trees turned into sticks, and those sticks go upright and sink to the bottom in the mud. All sorts of things changed with Mount St. Helens because it was something that we as humanity saw on a global scale because we could share that information. Yeah.
And the cool thing about Mount St. Helens was that it proved how the layering could happen in a quick succession. It doesn't need eons and centuries to happen. Like people could see that all of a sudden there was these new layers that were formed just by the explosion and not by thousands of years.
Yeah, there are so many great studies by ICR, especially on the Mount St. Helens. They saw evidence of rapid layering, and you could see all these different types of layers of dirt, and then rapid erosion just after that. When Spirit Lake started running again, it cut through all that mud and ash, and there's what's known as the mini Grand Canyon up there, because this water cut through this newly laid soil, and now you can see all the layers. But it didn't do it over 1,000 years or even 100 years. It was like a couple hundred days of this rapid water event cutting through there. So did Job see mountains eroding? When would people have observed this? Noah and his sons probably didn't get to see the flood happening. But when they came down out of the ark and they watched this new world still getting shaped by those cataclysmic forces, he would have seen a lot. Job, living at the end of the Ice Age, would have seen these huge melts happening, the landscape changing. And he's like, God, you have such power. Let's go back to the beginning. Job's friends believed in the reality of the worldwide flood before Moses was alive to write it down. David Guzik comments on Job 22:15 through 18. Will you keep to the old way which wicked men have trod? Eliphaz warned Job not to harden his heart and mind as those did who were swept away by a flood. This is possibly an obscure reference to the flood in Noah's time, and Eliphaz warned Job not to fall in the wickedness of those antediluvian people. The ruin of those sinners. They were cut down out of time. That is, they were cut off in the midst of their days, when as a man's time then went, many of them might in the course of nature have lived some hundreds of years longer. which made their immature extirpation the more grievous. They were cut down out of time to be hurried into eternity. In their foundation, the earth on which they built themselves and all their hopes was overthrown with a flood, the flood which was brought in upon the world of the ungodly. Eliphaz does not couch this in terms of a fairy tale or a myth, but in the stark terms of one who either saw the aftermath of the flood or heard a first-hand account. The language used throughout the book of Job suggests this was recent history, not a regurgitated tale from a small event in another corner of the world. Job and his friends regarded the flood as a real example of God's powerful judgment against sin. If Job and his friends considered it to be real and used such words that we've seen today to describe flood events, why should we have any doubt that it really existed? Not that I think any of you have any doubts about the flood of Noah being a whole world flood. But I just want, as we equip ourselves to argue sometimes with those that don't believe, we can point to the oldest book in the Bible and say, before Moses knew about the flood and wrote it down, these men were talking about it because they knew about it. This was not a story made up later based on a small event that happened in some corner of the world that a few people remembered and blew up. This is a real account that people saw and told and kept using those terms because they were applied to real life. These ancient people that had outlived all of their sons and grandsons and great-grandsons who had seen the flood firsthand, who saw the age of man shrink from Noah's 930 years to Shem's 602, down to Abraham, who at 160 says, man, I'm old. And then we see Jacob when he goes down to Pharaoh and says, few are the days of my sojourn, when he was 130. They knew people used to live a lot longer. They knew some of those people. I believe the book of Job has a lot of evidence to show that they believed the flood was real, and so we should believe the flood was real. God has such power, and the flood in the book of Job is always referred to as an evidence of God's judgment. It's real. Job's friends tried scaring him with the flood because they believed he was sinning, and God judged sin with a flood, so beware, you might suffer the same fate. Not necessarily a physical flood. But we also see in the flood, and even in these references, the mercy of God. When he dried up the waters, he provided places for them to live. Even though he overturned mountains, there was bountiful land that they lived on. God's power is shown both in his judgment and mercy, and we see that through the flood language in the book of Job. All right, any questions, comments, points of discussion? Cool. You're welcome. Oh, yes, this is the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, Answers in Genesis. Yeah, someday, soon. All right. For those of you new to our class, after we do our lesson,